Okay, everyone. Well, part two. You get part two again this week. So I hope everybody had time to go to the bathroom, get another cup of coffee, get a cookie, get whatever you want. And so hopefully we'll get through this now. So we were talking about the clothes of Joshua and how disgustingly filthy these clothes of Joshua were. And it wasn't that they were just a little bit soiled. We see that they are just these disgustingly filthy clothing. And what's interesting is that in verse 4 it says, "Remove the filthy garments from him. And he said to him, See, I have taken your iniquity away from you and will clothe you with festal robes." And so, what I think is interesting here is that you see the contrast within the verse of what Joshua is wearing and then what's going to be given to Joshua. But what is so amazing about the passage, what the verse is saying, is that Joshua can't remove his own garments. He can't, it doesn't appear that Joshua has the ability to take off the garments, that they have to be taken off for him. And so we see the angel of the Lord telling other beings that are around Joshua to take these garments off of him. And what we see is that in taking the garments off of him, he says that I have taken your iniquity away. And so it's not just that the clothes are physically dirty, but that the filthy garment represents the iniquity of not just Joshua, but the entire nation of Judah and those who are there in Jerusalem. And so what he says then is that Joshua, as the high priest, is then given festal garments. And these festal robes are splendid or costly. They're something that you only wear on special occasions. And some commentary writers say that these would be representative of the robes of the high priest, the high priestly garments that he was supposed to wear during the Day of Atonement and these different celebrations. But what's important for us to remember is that Joshua could not cleanse himself. He has to have the angel of the Lord come and to cleanse him. Now, why is it important that Joshua have these clothes taken off of him and new clothes put on him? What does this represent? And it would appear that it represents the cleansing of the priesthood. Now, it's important for us to remember that when they went into captivity, when you read Ezekiel and Jeremiah, and even when you read passages in Isaiah and different things like that, the corruption that had happened to the priesthood over time, that the priests were not faithful to their call to keep the people, to keep calling the people back to the Lord, to keep them pure in their religion. What we see is that the priesthood had been corrupted and had gone astray and had allowed things to come into the practices and the worship of God that corrupted the people and led to their demise. And so the importance of the cleansing of the priesthood is paramount, because if they're going to have a new temple, and if God has promised to come and dwell among them and to be among them again, it is important for the people to understand that the priesthood has been cleansed, that the priesthood can minister on behalf of the people the way that they're supposed to, that God will recognize them as a valid priesthood, and he will accept the offerings that they bring on behalf of the people. And so this whole idea of creating a new temple, and now we have a cleansed priesthood, and thus Judah can now worship God as they have been intended to worship him, is very important. And so what we see is that in the cleansing of Joshua, you have a representative cleansing of the priesthood, and what we see later on is we have a representative cleansing of the people as well. Now, what's interesting is that Zechariah gets so excited about this whole cleansing process of Joshua and everything that's going on. In verse 5, he says, "Then I said, let them put a clean turban on his head." So they put a clean turban on his head and clothed him with garments, while the angel of the Lord was standing by. Now, why was it important for this clean turban to be put on? And this is what you saw when you looked at Exodus 28. In Exodus 28, we have all of the garments of the priesthood being described and how they're to be created and what they're supposed to look like. And it's interesting because when you look at verse 3, it says, "You shall speak to all the skillful persons whom I have endowed with the spirit of wisdom, that they may make Aaron's garments to consecrate him, that he may minister as a priest to me." So these garments were to set Aaron apart. They were to consecrate Aaron for the service of God. That when you looked at the person wearing these garments, that you may not know their personal name, but you knew who they were and what they were doing and what those garments stood for. Now, if we go on to verse 37 in chapter 28, it says, "You shall fast." Oh, in verse, actually, we'll go to verse 36. It says, "You shall also make a plate of pure gold, and shall engrave on it like the engravings of a seal, holy to the Lord." So that phrase means set apart to God. It says, "And you shall fasten it on a blue cord, and it shall be on the turban. It shall be at the front of the turban." Okay, so there was a turban, then this plate was in the front of the turban, and it was fastened around the head with blue cords. "It shall be on Aaron's forehead, and Aaron shall take away the iniquity of the holy things which the sons of Israel consecrate with regard to all their holy gifts. And it shall always be on his forehead, that they may be accepted before the Lord." So what we see is that the holy priest, or the high priest, as he was wearing this, what it was representative of him setting these things apart, of taking away the iniquity of the things that the people brought, so that they could be holy and could be, so that God would accept the offerings. And so what we see is that the high priest representatively took away the iniquity or the guilt of sin, and this made these things that were consecrated to God, holy to God, acceptable before him. And so what we see is that Zechariah, in the midst of all of this, he gets really excited about the whole garment being taken off, and he basically says, "And give him a new turban too, and with this plate that's going to say, set apart unto God." Now, the question I think is really important here as we look at this is that, what does God continue to say to Joshua about the priesthood? Right? And as this vision is unfolding and as Zechariah is seeing it, what we see in verse 7 or in verse 6 is that the angel of the Lord admonished Joshua. And so now it appears that there's something being said personally to Joshua. And the word here for admonish means to testify as a witness, to say again and again. It has the idea as well as calling someone to turn back or to return back to them over and over again. But what we see here is the Lord says something, the angel of the Lord says something over and over again to Joshua about what he personally, it appears, is supposed to do. Now, the question here is that what was the role of the priesthood in the nation of Israel? And this is what you looked at in some of your cross-referencing as you were looking at this. In Exodus 19, when we look at this, what we see, starting in verse 5, as this particular chapter is about when the people are camped around Mount Sinai. God is getting ready to come and speak to them, and we have this whole chapter 19 and 20 about that event when the Lord comes onto Sinai and he speaks to them and he makes this covenant with them. And in verse 6 it says, "Now then, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my own possession among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the sons of Israel." So when God comes to Sinai and he makes this covenant with them, they as a nation are called to be set apart from the other nations as a kingdom of priests and a holy people set apart to God, a holy nation. Now, the question is, why would God need a kingdom or a nation of priests? And I think that the answer to that is that Israel was always set apart by God to be his representative nation among the other nations of what it meant to serve the living God. And they were supposed to share that information. They were supposed to live in light of the truth of that information. And that's why from the very beginning, he calls them out as a kingdom of priests and a holy nation among the other nations, right? So then what's interesting about it is, how did among the nation then of that was called out to be a priest, we see a particular family called out to be priests among the nation of priests. And that family and that tribe was the tribe of Levi. And then the family of Aaron was called to inhabit the office of high priest. And it was a generational thing. It would go from father to son, father to son, father to son. Now, the question was, over time, did they remain faithful to their call as the priesthood? And so if we look over at when we look, okay, hold on a second. If we look over, at Isaiah, verse 40, chapter 46, I got kind of confused there. Oh, and it's not 46, it's 64. So if we look at Isaiah 64, we're going to start in verse 5. He says, "You meet him who rejoices in doing righteousness, who remembers you in your ways. Behold, you were angry, for we sinned. We continued in them a long time. And shall we be saved? For all of us have become like one who is unclean, and all of our righteous deeds are like filthy garments. And all of us wither like a leaf, and our iniquities like the wind take us away. There is no one who calls on your name, who arouses himself to take hold of you. For you have hidden your face from us, and we are delivered unto the power of our iniquities." So this is what had happened over time to the condition of Israel. And the question is, where was the priesthood? Where were these people called and set apart unto God to keep the people from falling into this iniquity and to show them what it meant to truly worship God? And so what we see then, after we're told about the condition of the nation of Israel, we see what is the plea of the prophet then in verses 8 and 9. And the plea of the prophet is, "But now, O Lord, you are our Father. We are the clay, and you are our potter. And all of us are the work of your hand. Do not be angry beyond measure, O Lord, nor remember iniquity forever. Behold, look now, all of us are your people." So what we see here is the plea of Isaiah as God is showing him this iniquity, that Israel would be saved from this iniquity, that something would happen, that God would turn his eye, and he would not, that they would come back into that relationship that God had intended for them to have. And the question is that will God forgive them? Will God forgive if they turn around and if the priesthood does what it had been called to do? Now remember, in Exodus, they were called as a nation of priests. This is the cry of the prophet's heart for them as a nation of priests, how they have strayed from God. Will he forgive? In verse 5, it says yes, he will. Because verse 5 says, "You meet him who rejoices in doing righteousness, who remembers you in your ways." Right now, but that still leaves us the question of what had happened to the priesthood. Why weren't they doing what they were doing? Why is it that we see that the priesthood needs to be cleansed during the time of the building of the temple? So if we go over to 2 Chronicles chapter 29, what we read here is we're going to start in verse 3. It says, "In the first year of his reign," and this is talking about Hezekiah, King Hezekiah. "In the first year of Hezekiah's reign, in the first month, he opened the doors of the house of the Lord, and he repaired them. He brought in the priests and the Levites and gathered them into the square on the east. Then he said to them, 'Listen to me, O Levites. Consecrate yourselves now and consecrate the house of the Lord, the God of our fathers, and carry the uncleanness out from the holy place.'" So what we see here is that this passage, and if you read all of the history before this, what we see is that there had been foreign gods, foreign idols brought into the temple, that there was pagan worship happening within the temple, that the temple itself had become polluted because of the actions of the priests and because of what was going on in the temple. And then he goes on and he says, and what's interesting about this is that he references this plate on the turban about carry the uncleanness out from the holy place. Remember, the plate on the turban said, consecrated unto the Lord. And so what we see is that Hezekiah is telling them to remove the things that are not consecrated to the Lord, that are not set apart to him. And only the priest can do this, right? It wasn't like anybody could just go into the temple and clean the temple. It had to be specific people who were called to do that. So then in verse 6, he says, for our fathers have been unfaithful and have done evil in the sight of the Lord our God, and have forsaken him and turned their faces away from the dwelling place of the Lord and have turned their backs. They have also shut the doors of the porch. They have put out the lamps and have not burned incense or offered burnt offerings in the holy place to the God of Israel. Now, the question is, see, what's interesting about this is that no one who was a common person could do any of those things. The priests were the ones who were in charge of doing that. The priests were the ones who were in charge of opening the doors, of putting out the lamps, of filling the lamps with the oil to burn incense and the burnt offerings. So what we see here is that what Hezekiah is talking about is the faltering of the priesthood to do what they had been called to do. They had quit worshiping God the way that he had dictated that he was supposed to be worshiped throughout the Mosaic covenant. So then Hezekiah goes on and he says, therefore the wrath of the Lord was against Judah. What was the result of the priests not doing what they were supposed to? God's wrath came upon Judah and Jerusalem, and he has made them an object of terror, of horror, and of hissing, as you see with your own eyes. For behold, our fathers have fallen by the sword, and our sons and our daughters and our wives are in captivity for this. Now it is my heart to make a covenant with the Lord God of Israel, that his burning anger may turn away from us. My sons, do not be negligent now, for the Lord has chosen you to stand before him, to minister to him, and to be his ministers, and to burn incense. And so what we see is that the call of Hezekiah to the priesthood is to come back to the responsibility that they had been given by God. So what we see in chapter 3 with this cleansing of the priesthood is very important because of what we just saw had happened to the priesthood. It was important that the people understood that when Joshua went in there and the priests went with him, that they themselves could bear the sin of the people because the priesthood itself had been cleansed. But now what's important is that it appears that in the midst of this, that there's a personal promise to Joshua as the man who has been chosen right now to be the priest of God. And so in verse 7, it says, thus says the Lord of hosts, if you will walk in my ways, and the you is referring to Joshua, if you will walk in my ways, and if you will perform my service, then you will also govern my house, also have charge of my courts, and I will grant you free access among these who are standing here. Now, this is really interesting because we know what God expects of the priesthood from the passages that we read. We know what had happened to the priesthood from the passages that we read. We know now that Joshua has been cleansed of all of that. And so what is interesting is that it appears that what God is telling Joshua personally is that if Joshua follows God in the building of the temple the way that he is supposed to, if he will walk in God's ways, and if he will perform his service, then when the temple is completed, Joshua will serve as high priest in that temple. He says, then you also will also govern my house, right? And this house isn't built yet, but it's in the process of being built. So it appears that there's this promise to Joshua that if he will be faithful to the things that he is called as the priest, then he will serve as the high priest in the temple that is being created. So then he goes on and he says, now listen, Joshua, the high priest, you and your friends. His friends would be those who are also priests, who are sitting in front of you. Indeed, they are men who are a symbol. Okay, so these other priests who are around him, they're a symbol. And what they are is they're a symbol of the priesthood, right? They're a symbol of how intercession is made on behalf of the people and for the people in the eyes of God. He says, for behold, now these passages are really exciting, right? He goes, for behold, I am going to bring in my servant, the branch. Now the question is, what did they know about the branch? Right? And the branch is not a tree branch. The branch is referred to as a servant of God. So, what did they know about the branch? When they heard that word branch, did they just go, wow, I don't know what God's talking about concerning that. I have no clue. Or, what's this branch he's talking about? And what we see is that there was an understanding of this, this idea of the branch. So if you go over to Isaiah chapter 11, Isaiah 11 is one of the messianic prophecies that we are given early on about the Messiah and who he is. So let's read through this and see what we're told about the branch. It says, then a shoot will spring from the stem of Jesse, a branch from his roots will bear fruit. The Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, the spirit of wisdom and understanding, the spirit of counsel and strength, the spirit of knowledge and fear of the Lord. So now we see that the branch is a specific person and what lineage that specific person will have. They will be from the stem of Jesse. A branch from his root will bear fruit, right? Now, what we see is the character and the nature of this person that stems from Jesse. The Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, the spirit of wisdom and understanding, the spirit of counsel and strength, the spirit of knowledge and fear of the Lord. The three spirits, the three things that we're told about here, come from the Spirit of the Lord resting upon this person. And then in verse 3 it says, and he will delight in the fear of the Lord, and he will not judge by what his eyes see, nor make a decision by what his ears hear. But with righteousness he will judge the poor and decide with fairness for the afflicted of the earth. And he will strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he will slay the wicked. Also, righteousness will be the belt around his loins, and faithfulness the belt around his waist. And the wolf will dwell with the lamb, and the leopard will lie down with the young goat, and the calf and the young lion and the fatling together, and a little boy will lead them. Also, the cow and the bear will graze, their young will lie down together, and the lion will eat straw like the ox. The nursing child will play by the hole of the cobra, and the weaned child will put his hand in the viper's den. They will not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the water covers the sea. Then in that day, the nations will resort to the root of Jesse, who will stand as a signal for the people, and his resting place will be glorious. Right? Now, it is important for us to remember that these prophecies are after David, right? So we may read these and go, well, yeah, this is David, but David has already come and gone as king. The root of Jesse here has to be someone else after David who has these qualities. And what we see is that we not only see what he does, but we also see the environment that he creates. And even though David and some of the line of David, like Hezekiah and Josiah, may have met some of the criteria of this particular passage, they did not meet the criteria of the environment that exists when this particular root of Jesse is reigning. Right? So this has to be someone other than any of the kings that have come from David to this point. Right? So then in Jeremiah 23, in verses 5 and 6, it says, "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will raise up for David a righteous branch, and he will reign as king and act wisely and do justice and righteousness in the land. In his days, Judah will be saved and Israel will dwell securely. And this is his name by which he will be called, the Lord our righteousness." Now, this is interesting because what we see here is that a branch, now we know, before the branch was described as a servant. Remember in Isaiah, it says, "A shoot from among, so he will bear fruit, the Spirit of the Lord." So what we see here is that we know that he's going to come from the line of David, but what we see here is that, first of all, the branch is a king from David's line. It clearly states that he's a king. He will act wisely. He will do justice and righteousness. So we see that this are his actions as the king. And then Judah will saved and Israel will dwell in security. Now, what's interesting at this point in time, there is no nation of Israel, right? The nation of Israel has been assimilated into the Assyrian Empire, decades and decades and decades earlier. There is no nation of Israel. But yet clearly this passage says that Israel will dwell in security. Now, what's interesting is what this branch's name is. And the name of this branch, "And he will be called, the Lord our righteousness." Not the Lord is righteousness, the Lord our righteousness, right? So this branch is going to have some impact on the people that he reigns over, and through him, righteousness is going to be given to these people. Okay, so this is what we see about the branch. So, who is the branch is the question. And you and I, looking back at the prophecy, have to understand that the branch that is being talked about here, when he tells Joshua, when he says, "Now listen, Joshua the high priest, you and your friends who are sitting in front of you, indeed, they are men who are a symbol. They're a symbol of the priesthood. For behold, I am going to bring in my servant, the branch." Now, how does the branch impact the priesthood? And how the branch impacts the priesthood is that once the branch comes, he is the ultimate priest. He will be the ultimate high priest. Up until that time, the physical priesthood of Judah serving in Jerusalem is a physical reminder of that old covenant and everything that God deems necessary under that old covenant. But when the branch comes, the branch changes everything. The branch becomes the means of righteousness. And this is what the author of Hebrews talks about. Jesus, our great high priest. So they're a symbol of something until the branch comes. And once the branch comes, then the priesthood is changed. Right? So then not only did Zechariah see the branch, but then in the next verse he says, "For behold the stone." Right? So now we have the branch and now we have the stone. "For behold the stone that I have set before Joshua. On one stone are 7 eyes. Behold, I have engraved an inscription on it, declares the Lord of hosts, and I will remove the iniquity of the land in 1 day." Now, he doesn't tell us exactly what the inscription is, but could it be this inscription something about the removing of the iniquity? Because the stone is put in front of Joshua. He sees it right there. And it is described, it's a stone, and the stone has 7 eyes. And there is this inscription engraved upon it by God. But what is important is that God says that I will remove the iniquity of that land in 1 day. Now, in Isaiah, as you were looking at Isaiah 28, in verse 5, it says, "In that day the Lord of hosts will become a beautiful crown and a glorious diadem to the remnant of his people. a spirit of justice for him who sits in judgment, a strength to those who repel the onslaught at the gate. But if you skip down to verse 14, it says, therefore, hear the word of the Lord, O scoffers, who rule these people who are in Jerusalem. Because you have said, we have made a covenant with death, and with Sheol we have made a pact, the overwhelming scourge will not reach us when it passes by, for we have made falsehood our refuge, and we have concealed ourselves with deception. Therefore, thus says the Lord God, behold, I am laying in Zion a stone, a tested stone, a costly cornerstone for the foundation, firmly placed. He who believes in it will not be disturbed. Now, that passage talks about the stone that is being laid in Jerusalem, that's being laid in Zion, has to be a person, because God would never encourage his people to believe in an inanimate object. But it says here that this stone is a costly stone. It is going to be firmly placed, and he who believes in it will not be disturbed. Right? So the it here, the stone, has to be representative of a person, right? And in 1 Peter, what we see is an understanding of this passage as it goes on, in this understanding of who the stone is and what happens, right? So in 1 Peter chapter 2, it says in verse 4, and coming to him as to a living stone, right? So now this stone imagery is put to Christ, coming to him as a living stone. He is the living stone. He says, a living stone which has been rejected by men, but is choice and precious in the sight of God. You also, as living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house for a holy priesthood to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. For this is contained in Scripture. Behold, I lay in Zion a choice stone, a precious cornerstone, and he who believes in him will not be disappointed. This precious value, then, is for you who believe, but for those who disbelieve, the stone which the builders rejected, this became the very cornerstone, and a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. For they stumble because they are disobedient to the word, and to this doom they are disappointed, are also appointed. So what we see is that the stone that is talked about in Isaiah, the stone turns out to be the Messiah, right? And this is important for us to understand. It's so beautiful because one commentary writer talks about, why is it that we have a hard time differentiating between the future work of the Messiah and all of these things. And it appears that the prophets don't have a problem. And his answer is that when these prophecies were given to the prophets, what they saw them was one continuous chain of thought, that there wasn't this idea that there would be a separation from the first time the Messiah came until the second time. It was just one continuous chain of thought and understanding of who the Messiah would be and what the Messiah would do. And this is exactly what we see in these passages. We see this passage talking about Joshua and the cleansing of the priesthood and what that represents to the people then, but then in the very next breath, the vision turns, and what we start seeing is the ultimate priest, the ultimate one who redeemed them, and that is the person of Jesus Christ, the branch and the root of Jesse, the stone that was rejected but became the cornerstone. And so this is what is so beautiful about this passage and how it flows. But not only does this stone have this inscription upon it, but what is important is that the inscription tells us that the iniquity of the people will be taken away in one day. Just as Joshua had been immediately cleansed when the angel of the Lord told those who were with him to take off his clothing, so the cleansing of the nation will happen that quickly. Because the vision goes on and it says, now, he says in verse 9, for behold, the stone that I have set before Joshua, on one stone are 7 eyes, And this idea of the seven eyes we see this as the seven spirits. If we look at Revelation, the seven spirits of God, the eyes of the Lord moving to and fro, they're representative of the eye of God watching all and doing all. And this is what we saw when you looked over at 2 Chronicles 16:9. This idea that the eyes of the Lord move to and fro throughout the earth so that he may strongly support those whose heart is completely his. And those who have acted foolishly in this, indeed, for now you will surely have worse. But this idea that the eyes of God are constantly moving to and fro, and this is exactly what you saw when you looked at Revelation. But is this idea that at some point in time, the iniquity of the nation, okay, as God is watching it, and as God is going to move and do something, it will not be a gradual thing at some point in time. It will happen in one day. So when you looked over at Micah, in Micah chapter 4, this is a really interesting passage because it talks about the understanding of in one day, right? And on that day, in verse 10. Those are specific time frames, especially in prophecy, that you really need to pay attention to. And so in Micah chapter 4, it says, "And it came about in the last days that the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as the chief of the mountains. It will be raised above the hills, and the people will stream to it. Many nations will come and say, 'Come, and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord and to the house of God of Jacob, that he may teach us about his ways, that we may walk in his paths. For from Zion will go forth the law, even the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And he will judge between many peoples and render decisions for mighty distant nations. Then they will hammer their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not lift up sword against nation, and never again will they train for war. Each of them will sit under his vine and under his fig tree, with no one to make them afraid, for the mouth of the Lord of the hosts has spoken. Though all the people walk, each in the name of his God, as for us, we will walk in the name of the Lord our God forever and ever. In that day, declares the Lord, I will assemble the lame and gather the outcasts, even those whom I have afflicted. I will make the lame a remnant and the outcasts a strong nation, and the Lord will reign over them in the Mount Zion from now on and forever. As for you, tower of the flock, hill of the daughter of Zion, to you will come, even the former dominion will come, the kingdom of the daughter of Jerusalem. And so what you see is that this is exactly God is talking about through this prophecy to Zechariah, a time when the nation of Israel and Judah will be restored, a time when their iniquity will be taken away from them, and because their iniquity is gone, the blessing of God can be poured out upon them. And this is exactly what he says in the last verse. In the end of verse 9, he says, "And I will remove the iniquity of that land in one day." So what we see is that they will be cleansed completely, immediately, in one day. In that day, then we see what happens as a result of that cleansing. In that day, declares the Lord of hosts, every one of you will invite his neighbor to sit under his vine and under his fig tree. So what we see is a time of peace and sustenance. It's a time of peace and security. And so the point of this vision, then, as we see in chapter 3, is the restoration and the cleansing of the priesthood and the impact that cleansing is going to have on the nation of Israel. The point of the vision is the complete cleansing and redemption of Israel, that they become what they were intended to become from the very beginning, is that nation of priests, that their iniquity will be removed from them, and they will be a holy kingdom and a nation of priests before God. So see, it progresses. That the God says that he is going to have compassion on Jerusalem and Judah once again, that he's going to pour out wrath on the nations that have taken their punishment of them too far, that he's going to come and he's going to live with them and restore them. And then what we see is that Jerusalem in the third vision, it grows to, you can't put any boundary upon it because God is the wall that protects it. God's glory is among them. And so you see the restoration of Jerusalem to the place of God's dwelling that it was called to be. Then the fourth vision comes along, and now there's a restoration of the priesthood, of what they are intended to be. And the only one that could restore them to that position is God. And so you see a restoration of the priesthood. And in the restoration of the priesthood, you see the iniquity of the nation moved and the iniquity of the people. Ultimately, through the branch that will come, that will be the ultimate high priest, and is the only one who is able to remove the iniquity from them, right? So that's how the vision about Joshua fits into all of this. When we get over to chapter 4, we see the fifth vision. And the fifth vision is about someone else. Now, the fifth vision is really interesting because and you were told to draw this out, and I hope that you did draw this out. But what's interesting about this is the fifth vision is about this lamp and the tree and all of that kind of stuff, right? So let's read it. Then the angel who was speaking with me returned and roused me as a man who is awakened from his sleep. He said to me, "What do you see?" And I said, "I see and behold a lampstand, all of gold, with its bowl on top of it, and its 7 lamps on it, with 7 spouts belonging to each of the lamps which are on the top of it. Also 2 olive trees by it, one on the right side of the bowl, and the other on its left side." Then I said to the angel who was speaking with me, saying, "What are these, my Lord?" And now, the question is about the olive trees. What are these trees? Right? Then he said to me, "This is the word of the Lord to Zerubbabel." Now, who is Zerubbabel? And as you looked in Ezra and Haggai, and as we looked at this last week, Zerubbabel is the one who is appointed as the governor of Judah with the first group of the remnant that comes back. He and Joshua come back together. They both have different functions that are very important to the people. Joshua serves as high priest, Zerubbabel serves as the governor. But what was important is that both of them had been there at the laying of the foundation of the temple when they had first come back. Neither of them, though, in 14 years had completed what they had been sent back to Jerusalem to complete, right? Now, one of the things that is important as you look at this is that Zerubbabel had many things that he had to do as the governor of Judah, not just to oversee the building of the temple. What we see is that when we read the text through Ezra and then through some of these other things, is that he was a very capable leader. He was a very gifted leader that God had sent back with them in the person of Zerubbabel. But what is also interesting about Zerubbabel, when you looked at this, if you looked at Matthew, what we also see is that Zerubbabel was of the house of David. Zerubbabel is an ancestor of Christ, right? So what you see is this connection that the house of David, through Zerubbabel, is once again coming and governing in the land of Judah. Now, he can't serve as king. He could easily have been king in the line of David, but because Judah and Jerusalem are still under the thumb of the Persians, he can't be king, but he is brought back as the governor, right? So here we have the line of Jesse, that promise to David, being continued, that someone in his line would have power. But what is important now is that Zerubbabel had been picked by God not only to be the governor of Judah, but he had been called the governor for a specific reason. What is the specific reason? And so what we see is that in verse 6 it says, "Then he said to me, this is the word of the Lord to Zerubbabel, saying, not by might nor by power, but by my spirit, says the Lord of hosts. What are you, O great mountain, before Zerubbabel, who will become a plain? And he will bring forth the top stone with shouts of grace, grace on it." Now, what we see here and what we saw in the passages of Ezra and Haggai is that Zerubbabel was called to build the temple. Zerubbabel was supposed to oversee that building project. And right here, what we see is that God tells Zerubbabel that even though he may be a very competent leader, even though he may be a very competent governor, and he was, the building of the temple would not be done in his strength and his power alone. It wouldn't be done by him. It would be done by who? And this is where we see, not by might, nor by power, which Zerubbabel had both. He says, but by my spirit, says the Lord. So what does Zerubbabel know now? That he'll be the instrument of God's miraculous work in the rebuilding of the temple, right? And I wonder if this was a very encouraging thing to Zerubbabel, that God had proclaimed that this work would be done. God wanted this work to be done, but it wasn't up to Zerubbabel to accomplish it through his effort and his strength, but that God said it will be accomplished through my spirit. Now let me ask you, does that have any bearing on us today? How many of us are running around trying to accomplish things that God has not called us to do, or accomplishing things that God has called us to do, but we're trying to do it from our own strength and our own power? I think this verse is very important for us to remember. If God has called us to it, if it is something that God has commissioned us to do, He is the source of everything that comes in the completion of that call, in the completion of that commission. It is by His Spirit that He accomplishes the things that He has deemed are to be done. No different now than it was for Zerubbabel, right? And so this is why he goes on in the vision, and Zechariah says, what are you, O great mountain? Now, the mountain that is probably being talked about here is the building of the temple, and the destruction that was there in front of them in the city. I mean, when they came back, Jerusalem was nothing but rubble, right? And remember, to this point, they have only laid the foundation of the temple. They haven't cleared out all of the other debris, all of these things, but to Zerubbabel and the people, this work of rebuilding the temple must look like a mountain of labor, and a mountain that is a huge thing to climb up in the rebuilding of this temple. But God, in connection to His Spirit doing it, He says, so what are you, O great mountain, before Zerubbabel? You will become a plain. You will become a level surface. Now remember, who's going to do the leveling and who's going to be the power, the engine behind all of this work? God's Spirit is going to be. And it says, and you will become a plain, and he, Zerubbabel, will bring forth the top stone with the shouts of grace, grace on it. So what is Zerubbabel promised here? Is that he will be the finisher of the temple, that he will finish it. Right? And as he lays the capstone, and this is this idea of the laying of the capstone was the finishing stone of the entire building project. So when he lays the top stone or the capstone, what we're told is that it will be laid to shouts of grace, grace to it. So what we see is that Zerubbabel is promised that he will finish the project that God has put before him as the most important thing that he'll ever do in his life, which is the completion of the building of the temple. Now, what's interesting about this is that in this vision, there's also a word to Zechariah. And in verse 8, we see also the word of the Lord came to me saying, the hands of Zerubbabel have laid the foundation of this house, and his hands will finish it. Then you will know that the Lord of hosts has sent me to you. So not only will the completion of the temple have an impact on the people in their understanding of who Joshua is or who Zerubbabel is, but the completion of the temple will lend authority to Zechariah as God's prophet, as God's spokesperson. So when Zerubbabel finishes the temple, all will know that the Lord spoke through Zechariah. And the same could be said for Haggai. But this particular prophecy about when the temple is finished, then Zechariah, people will know that you were my prophet, that I spoke through you. Then you will know, and he will know as well, right? The people will know, and Zechariah will know that the Lord of hosts has sent me to you. Now, what is the state of the temple, though, when this prophecy is made? The state of the temple is total destruction, right? All that is built at this moment in time is the foundation. That's it. It is going to be a huge building project. But is there an encouragement to it? And yes, there is. This promise that it will be done by God's Spirit. And so this is the promise to Zerubbabel. This is the promise to the people and to Zerubbabel, that they will know that Zechariah is a true prophet of God when this is all completed. But that doesn't answer the question about the lampstand and all of the different things in the vision about the lampstand. So when we look at this, and if we go back and we read this prophecy, let's go back. So he says in verse 9, the hands of Zerubbabel have laid the foundation of this house, and his hands will finish it. Then you will know that the Lord of hosts has sent me to you. For who has despised the day of small things? But these 7 will be glad when they see the plumb line in the hand of Zerubbabel. These are the eyes of the Lord, which range to and fro about throughout the earth. Now, the 7 have to refer back to the 7 eyes that were on the stone, right? And this is what we saw in those verses about the eyes of God going to and fro in Chronicles and in Revelation. So what we see here is that even the smallest act, which is Zerubbabel picking up that plumb line, that small act in that day, the day of small things, it's not too big of a thing to pick up a plumb line and to, make that line. But what that plumb line signifies is the project that is going to follow that small act. And that's why the prophet is told, for who has despised the day of small things? God is not going to despise the day of this small act of Zerubbabel when he picks up that plumb line. It's going to be the beginning of this mighty work of God in the nation of Israel. And he goes on and he says, but these 7 will be glad when they see the plumb line in the hand of Zerubbabel. These are the eyes of the Lord, which range to and fro throughout the earth. Now, the question is now, what is the vision? Okay, the vision is about Zerubbabel, but there are other components to the vision, right? So Zechariah asks again about the vision, and in verse 11 he says, then I said to him, okay, the angelic companion that he has, then I said to him, what are these 2 olive trees on the right of the lampstand and on the left? Right? And I answered the second time and said to him. So now what we see is that what catches Zechariah's attention in the vision are the 2 olive trees, right? And so he says, and I answered the second time and said to him, the angelic companion, what are the 2 olive branches which are beside the 2 golden pipes which empty the golden oil from themselves? And he answered me saying, do you not know what these are? And I said, no, my Lord. Then he said, these are the 2 anointed ones who are standing by the Lord of the whole earth. Now, the word for anointed ones here, you saw this if you have your workbook. The phrase here is sons of fresh oil. Now, remember we've talked about in the past that we have to be careful that we don't give an assumed interpretation to the same phrase that we see over and over. The anointed ones Okay, the idea of anointing has a broad concept and context within the word. We see that kings were anointed, that people who were chosen for a certain purpose were anointed, and these two men have been chosen for a certain purpose. So the question is, these are the two anointed ones who are standing by the Lord of the whole earth. Who are they? And I think it's interesting because the angel assumes that Zechariah will come to understand who they are, because he asks him, "Do you not know what these are?" See, there's an assumption on the part of the angel that Zechariah understands who this is, what these two trees represent, or who these two trees represent. And then we see that the two trees represent people. Two people who are called the sons of fresh oil, or the anointed ones, who are standing by the Lord of the whole earth. So, who do you think the two trees represent? Right? Now, remember, in the context of the passage, who have the last two visions been about? Because a lot of times we look at this and we take it totally out of context and, well, it must be, Elijah, Elisha, it's, all these other prophets or all these other people. But who are the two visions about, and how do they tie together? See, this is the understanding of this prophecy, and I think this is why the angel says, don't you know who they are? And who of the last two chapters been about? They've been about Joshua as the high priest and Zerubbabel as the governor who's going to build the temple. In the context of the verses, it would appear that the two olive trees who are beside this lamp that the oil is going into are Joshua as the high priest. So he is the high priest then, that he will lead them in the temple. He will lead them in the worship of God. And then Zerubbabel as the one who is bringing the community into that work of the Lord in building the temple and finishing what God has called them to do. And the lampstand, it would appear, is the community of Judah and Jerusalem, because the oil is going into that, and what you see is the light and the eyes of God roaming to and fro and all of that kind of thing as the people are doing the work that he has sent them back to do. Now, you can disagree, and and like we say about prophecy, we have to hold all of these interpretations loosely. But what's interesting is the chapters 3 and 4 are about two specific people: Joshua the high priest, Zerubbabel, the one who is sent as governor to complete the temple. It would be uncharacteristic within the vision for somehow there to be a different interpretation of other beings other than those two men at the end of this vision. Right? So what we see is that the other vision was about Joshua as the high priest. The point of this vision is the completion of the temple, and that Zerubbabel will be the one to complete the temple, that he will be in charge of that entire temple construction, and that he will do it by the Spirit of God, not by his own power, not by his own might. Right? Now, I know some of you may have a bunch of questions about this. You can text me, you can email me, but we have to interpret the vision in the context that we have been given. It would appear to me that the best understanding of the vision in the context is that these trees are Joshua the high priest, Zerubbabel the governor, the oil that is going from them into the lamp, it would appear, is the community of people that have been brought back to Jerusalem to do what they have been called to do, to build the temple, to serve God as they're supposed to once that temple is finished. And that is the beginning of the fulfillment of God coming back and dwelling with his people. Now, what I think is important is that we saw that ultimately this idea that this coming of the Spirit of God to complete this has a fulfillment even fuller in the New Testament, where in John chapter 14, where Jesus talks about that the Spirit would not, because of his work as the branch and the stone, that the Spirit of God would not now come upon people and be that and help them with an outward work or something like that, what we see here with Zerubbabel. But the Spirit of God would indwell us, that the Spirit of God would come and live within his people at some point in time. And that Spirit of God living within his people, like you saw in Ephesians, becomes the pledge of that greater gift that comes at our redemption, and when we come into that glorification of who we are as his people. But I think it's so interesting as we look at this and as we close. So many times we think that the Spirit of God is only moving in the New Testament. And what I think is beautiful about these two chapters is we see Christ as the angel of the Lord cleansing Joshua, because Joshua can't cleanse himself, and cleansing the people ultimately of Judah and Israel because they can't cleanse themselves. The branch and the stone will come and take away their iniquity. And then in the next chapter, the statement that not by your might or by your power, but by my Spirit, the things that God had called Zerubbabel to do would be done. And I love that because it has such a continuity of purpose between Old and New Testament. You see this continuity of the promise of the Redeemer, of the promise of the one who would take away the iniquity of humanity. And then you see the Spirit of God working and doing these amazing things in the Old Testament. And so when we get to the New Testament, it's just a deeper completion of these concepts and these things that we're told about the Trinity that are started in the Old Testament. So, do we, like Joshua, stand there with Satan accusing us all the time of all kinds of things that we have done? Yes. And what does Christ do for us? He takes away that iniquity, just as he took it away for Joshua. And at some point in time, the iniquity of all humanity will be, or let me rephrase that, the iniquity of all who believe in him in humanity will be taken away. In that day, the nation of Judah, the nation of Israel, and before we were told the nations that would come to them because of the glory of God and the presence of God dwelling in Jerusalem, that iniquity will be taken away from them. Then we see this idea that anything that we do, that we are called by God to do, is purely done by his power and his strength. And you know what? That is an amazing blessing. That is an amazing burden, I hope, that is lifted from you as you are serving and ministering for God. It is not by your strength. It is not by my power, but it is by us being indwelled by the Spirit. And so I hope that these two passages have really encouraged you. I hope that you're starting to see this connection between old and new in these prophecies. I have to tell you, we are 3 weeks into Zechariah, and I am absolutely loving this book. I hope that you're enjoying it as much as I am. And so with that being said, I will see you next week as we meet together again over YouTube to discuss the next couple of chapters of Zechariah. But if you remember any questions, any thoughts, just text me or email and we will talk about it. So I miss all of you. I hope all of you are doing well. You're all in my prayers, and I hope that I can see you face to face in person and give all of you a hug soon. So have a good week, and we will talk soon.